Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 205. And this time I'm going to talk about Cecil Taylor's outing from 1958, well, released in 1959, Looking Ahead with his quartet at the time. This is a circa 1980s reissue after Contemporary had been sold to Fantasy. Some people fuss about the quality of some of the pressings around that time. Personally, I think this sounds absolutely pristine, and I would highly recommend it. Taylor is widely considered to be a free jazz pioneer, which he was, but he was more than that. He was very much his own thing. He was classically trained, which was an influence he kept throughout his career, and he's very much kind of a meeting point between the Pan-Africanist and avant-garde school of people like Ayler and Shep and so on in the 1960s, and contemporary European classical composers around the same time. This album, of course, is recorded well before all those innovations of the 60s, but the seeds are still there. In particular, his highly physical approach to playing, a very percussive style of playing. People have likened it to playing the piano like a drum kit. It's said that no one ever played like Taylor before and no one ever will again. Likely true. This record is also notable, however, for some really excellent and very cool work on vibes by Earl Griffith. Cecil Taylor was born in March 1929 to a middle-class black family in Queens. His dad was a chef. His mom was quite an urbane and sophisticated woman. She spoke German and French as well as English. She had a very artistic sensibility. She wanted her son to become a lawyer or a doctor or a dentist. He wanted to become a musician. She said, okay, but you have to apply some rigor, so she made him practice 6 days a week, and he could do something else on the Sunday, and it was on his day of rest, as he says, that he actually began to work out what his music was actually going to be when he didn't have her looking over his shoulder. Although financially more comfortable than most of his peers growing up, Taylor was not without a set of challenges. His mom died of cancer when he was 14. He was queer. He also, of course, faced the racism that all black musicians faced. He was also never really one of the guys because his way to the top had been different from a lot of other jazz players. He was classically educated as a teenager, and then as a young man in the early 1950s, he went off to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston to continue his studies studying composition. In 1955, he graduates, leaves Boston, and comes back to New York, and initially he does a bit of work as a sideman. First of all with Johnny Hodges, who of course had been a sideman himself for Duke Ellington for so many years, and also with Hot Lips Page. Soon afterwards, he forms his first quartet, with Steve Lacy on alto sax, Will Neidlinger on bass, and Dennis Charles on drums. From that point on, he never played as a sideman again, which is kind of unusual when you think about how the jazz world functions. In 1956, he and the quartet went into the studio to make their first LP called Jazz Advance. That record contains both standards and originals. It's pretty much mainstream hard bop of the day, but there are some inklings that where he's going to go is very different from where he is, and already you can tell that, typical chordal jazz is not going to contain him for too long. They played the Newport Jazz Festival in 1957, which becomes the album At Newport. And then in 1958, Taylor gets involved with the group pulled together by a producer, which also included John Coltrane. Most of the historical releases of that record have it under the title of Coltrane Time. Taylor's music is evolving rapidly in the late 1950s, moving away from bop and from conventional jazz. He continued to value his European training and worked some of those ideas and some of the forms that he liked into his music. Sets him apart, as I mentioned, from a lot of his contemporaries who were looking much more to shed Western strictures and to focus on Africa in particular for their inspiration. For the next 15 to 20 years, despite producing a whole slew of records which were highly popular with critics, he could barely sell any of them, and he really had a hard time making ends meet. He couldn't get gigs. When he did get gigs, often people reacted very poorly. He had audiences laugh at him. He had people come up to him and challenge him, saying, this isn't really music. Despite the fact that he was identified by Downbeat as an up-and-coming star, articles being written questioning whether or not what he was doing was actually jazz at all. And this, of course, is a cross that he had to bear along with people like Eric Dolphy, John Coltrane, and Ornette Coleman. There are stories of him being asked to play private parties by rich Fifth Avenue socialites without ever actually having heard him, because he was reputed to be quite good amongst the critics, and then being shut down after playing for less than a minute. Miles Davis referred to his music as sad shit. Leonard Feather, the critic, described his music as something that a guy with a jackhammer could do just as well. And more recently, Branford Marsalis, whom I would consider to be the Greta Van Fleet of the jazz world, called his work self-indulgent bullshit. But Taylor also had a limited number of very staunch allies and backers, and those included Nat Hentoff, the critic, who writes the liner notes here, and it also included Elvin Jones, John Coltrane's drummer, who, as John Coltrane would find out, was not somebody who was going to sit around and just tolerate any old noise. Taylor survives all this despite never making enough money in the 1960s to quit his day job and become a full-time musician. His day job was normally either washing dishes or working in a dry cleaners. He works with a young Archie Shepp in the early 1960s, and then he meets up with Jimmy Lyons, a saxophonist with whom he forms a great bond, and for 20 years they worked together, and the two of them were basically the core of what became known as the Cecil Taylor unit. After 15 years of basically living hand to mouth and being more notorious and famous, in the early 1970s, Taylor finally begins to experience some popularity. He wins a Guggenheim Fellowship, which eases his financial worries. He starts to teach at a whole bunch of different music schools. I mean, nobody could really teach what he was doing except for him, and so he was being asked to do that. In 1978, he was invited to the White House to go to a jazz festival, which Jimmy Carter had decided to host, and people like Clark Terry and Sonny Rollins, Stan Getz were there, a lot of mainstream players. But the person that Carter really wanted to focus on after his performance was Taylor. And he comes up to him afterwards, takes his hands in his own and says, "How did you ever learn to play the piano like that? I've never heard anybody do that." And I guess Taylor says to him, "Hell, I've been doing that for 35 years. This record is made in Nola's Penthouse Studio in New York on June the 9th, 1958. Now that's at the top of the old Steinway building at 111 West 57th. The studio had been started by Vincent Nola Sr. in 1940, and then been taken over by Vincent Nola Jr., and Tommy Nola, the other son, is the engineer on this record and many other records. Vincent Sr. had started the business after retiring from his career as an opera singer and as a vocal coach. The initial idea was to rent the space out as rehearsal space, particularly for Broadway shows, and shows like South Pacific in their first run actually did their rehearsals in this particular space. But Vincent Jr. realized that there was a lot more money in being a recording studio than there was being a rehearsal space. You could charge in the 1950s $1.50 an hour, if you can believe it, for a rehearsal space in New York, but you could charge up to $15 an hour for recording time. The studio is not that well known, but it was the site of a number of great recordings, including some by Thelonious Monk. It survives all the way to 2014, when approval comes in for a tower, which is going to be, I think, the fourth tallest skyscraper in the United States, to be built physically next to the Steinway building, and so you couldn't really run a recording studio when there were several years of construction ahead. Billionaires 1, Art and Beauty, nil. This record is produced by Nat Hentoff, the jazz critic, who also wrote the liner notes, as I mentioned. He, of course, is known for his extensive body of criticism, his work with Downbeat and other publications. He's also known for his civil rights activism and a wide variety of writings. But I was surprised to find out that he actually produced over 60 different jazz records through the course of his career as well. The record, of course, features Cecil Taylor on piano. The percussive element of the sound of the quartet is augmented because the horn player is dropped and Earl Griffith comes in on vibes, and Neidlinger and Charles repeat on bass and drums. Side 1 starts with Luya, the Glorious Step. After a bit of a monkish kind of intro by Taylor, when the band comes in, they start to swing pretty hard, actually, under Griffith's vibes. It's a pretty standard hard bop track a lot of the time, except, of course, for Taylor's contributions. I mentioned Monk and his influence. There's also very much a feel of Dave Brubeck after a few cognacs with the block chords being played at interesting places. It's really pretty far out for 1958. Neidlinger is really driving the band underneath, really quite powerfully, and you never really know where Taylor's going, so it's very, very exciting, and that sense of excitement runs all the way through the record. The next song is African Violets, which is a ballad by Griffith, or at least I say it's a ballad, but the rhythms at times do some kind of unusual things. Taylor's solo here is really compelling, and then you get this drum solo, which starts out like the most laid-back drum solo, but then it picks up in some very fascinating ways. It's not like any drum solo I've ever heard. For the final track on side 1, Of What, Griffith stands aside on vibes, and so you're down to a trio format. Neidlinger is soon to the fore. All three at times are playing very heavily percussive elements, and there's a really cool call and answer bit between Taylor on piano and Charles on drums. Side 2 starts with Wallering, and the quartet plays the main melody in kind of a deconstructed way at first before bringing it all together. There's a brilliant bit on vibes from Griffith, a very quirky little solo by Taylor, and then a very subversive coda. Toll, the second track on side 2, starts with this very staccato vibe, but then eventually Neidlinger steps into this really delicious kind of walking bass line, which is a platform for both the vibes and the piano, a very smoky late-night vibe to this track. The most powerful track on the record, although I don't really have a real favorite, I kind of like this all the way through, is the last track, Excursions on a Wobbly Rail. This begins with a very urgent kind of a feel, and it's a very New York 1958 kind of a track, a very hustle-bustle feeling kind of a track, which is probably appropriate because this song is very much a tribute in Taylor's own way towards Ellington, and a lot of the feel of the chords and a lot of the way this whole song is arranged, although it's clearly much more avant-garde than Ellington would ever get, has a strangely Ellingtonian feel. This is a completely riveting record, which still feels fresh. If it's less remarkable now than it might have been in 1958, it's only because of the innovation of people like Taylor, which we view in hindsight. I would highly recommend it as an introductory step into the world of Taylor's music, and then to wade down and wade in and wade further forward into the future as you feel comfortable. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.